Hello everybody. Welcome to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today comes to us from England, and it is a story about a very smart young woman and how she took care of her family and the people that were around her and how she outsmarted a giant in the process. This is the story of Molly Whuppie. Once long ago, there was a woodcutter, and he had a lot of children. And one day, to get enough money for all of those children, he had decided that his children needed to help out, and they needed to go out into the forest and find wood too. So one day, he gave the three youngest children, who were all girls, a slice of bread and treacle each, which is kind of like honey, and he sent them out into the forest to find wood. And so they walked out into the forest to gather wood for their father, like they were used to doing. But this time, they walked a little further than they normally did, and they got lost. And so they were lost in the dark forest. But the youngest, whose name was Molly said, I think if we just stay calm, and maybe we sit down and take a little bit of a rest and eat our bread and treacle that Father gave us. Then once we've done that, then maybe we can start walking again and we can try to find our way home. And so her sisters, they knew Molly was pretty clever, and so they decided that was probably the best plan. So they sat down and had a little rest and ate their bread and treacle. And when they were done eating, they were a little tired. And so they all pretty soon dropped off to sleep. Well, by the time they woke up, it was starting to get dark. And so they knew that they needed to find some place to stay the night. And by that time, they were starting to get a little hungry again. And so they all got up and they started walking. Well, before too much longer, Molly spotted a light through the trees. And so they decided to go towards that light, and perhaps there would be a kind person there who would be willing to let them stay the night at their house, and then in the morning would give them directions back to their father's house. So Molly and her sisters went toward the light. When they got to the light, what they found was that it wasn't just a light in a cottage window as they had expected, but it was a light in the window of a very large house. And so Molly thought for sure there would be somebody here who would be willing to give them a little bit of dinner and maybe a corner to sleep in somewhere until they could go home in the morning. So they walked up to the door and they knocked on the door. And a woman came to the door. She was a little bit bigger than normal, but not too huge. And Molly said, "Please, ma'am, we're very hungry and we're very tired. Might you have a corner we could sleep in and a little bite of something we can eat?" And the woman looked at her and said, "Bite of something to eat? My husband is a giant. If you stay here, he will eat you." And Molly said, "Please, ma'am, we're very tired and we're very hungry and we promised to stay out of the giant's way. Please, we're very cold. Can't we please come in and just warm up a little bit and have a little bite of something to eat, and we'll be on our way?" The woman said, "All right. I don't like to see children go hungry." And so she brought the three girls into the kitchen, and she sat them down near the fire to warm up, and she gave them each a bowl of bread and milk to eat. Well, they had no sooner begun to eat their bread and milk than there was a thumping sound at the door, and in walked the giant. He was very excited to see three such tender, juicy young girls staying in his house. But his wife told him she already had supper ready, and he should eat that, and he could talk about what they would do with the girls in the morning. Now, it just so happened that the giant also had three daughters, and before they put all of the girls to bed tonight in one big bed, the giant made a game out of putting little necklaces on the girls. And when the six girls went upstairs together, the three giant girls and the three regular girls, Molly and her sisters, it just so happened that the three giant girls had three golden chains around their necks. and that Molly and her sisters were wearing necklaces of golden straw. Now Molly, being a very clever girl, knew that this was probably not an accident. And so she waited until all of the others were asleep. And then she went and very carefully she took the 3 golden chains off of the 3 giants' daughters. And she took the golden straw necklaces off of her sisters and off of her own neck. And she put the straw necklaces on the giant's daughters and the chains on her sisters' necks and on hers. And then she laid back down in the bed. Well, it turned out to be a good thing that she had, for the giant came upstairs and he felt on the bed and he found the 3 girls with the straw necklaces, and he picked them up out of the bed and he took them down to his basement and he locked them up in the cellar. And then he went to bed thinking that his wife could make him a good breakfast with them in the morning. Now, as soon as the giant had gone to sleep and his snores were rattling the rafters, Molly woke her sisters up with a whisper and she said, "We have to go now." And the 3 girls hurriedly slipped out of the house as quietly as they could, and they ran and they ran and they ran and they ran until they didn't think they could run anymore. And just as they were starting to think they really couldn't run anymore, they came to another very big house. But this house wasn't all alone in the middle of the woods. This house had a big lake outside with lots of wild swans floating on it, and big trees and statues around it, and a big garden, and 1,000 windows on the house. It was the house of the king. And when Molly and her sisters came running up to the house, the guards stopped them and asked what they were doing there. And when Molly told them the story, the guards took them straight to the king. And Molly told the story to the king. And the king said, "Well, Molly, you and your sisters are welcome to stay here. You've done one great thing, and that's done well. But I could tell you another thing, and that would be even better." And Molly said, "Well, tell me then, king." And the king said, "That giant that you ran away from, he has something of mine. He has a sword. He has it hung on the wall. I know it's there because one of my champions managed to get close enough to see it, but not close enough to get it back. And if you could go there, and if you could get the big sword, my sword that's hung on the wall of the giant's house, and bring it back to me, I tell you what I'll do for you. I will let your oldest sister marry my oldest son." Molly looked at the oldest prince, and she looked at her oldest sister, and she said, "Very well, king, I will bring you back your sword." And so she borrowed a cloak, and she wrapped it around herself, and she crept back through the woods. And when she got to the giant's house, she waited until he was very noisily eating his dinner in the kitchen, and she crept up the stairs and she hid under his bed. Well, the giant came to bed, and he fell asleep, and when his snores were rattling the rafters, Molly crept out from underneath the bed, and she took that sword off the wall. Now, thankfully, it was not a giant-sized sword, but even a king-sized sword is a little bit large for a young woman like Molly. And so as she was slipping out the door with it, she caught it against the door frame by accident, and it rattled in the scabbard. And the giant woke up, and Molly started running, and the giant started running, and they ran and they ran and they ran until they came to a bridge across the river. And this bridge was called the Bridge of One Hair because it was very thin and it was very narrow, and it looked rather delicate. It was quite strong enough to hold Molly, but it was not strong enough to hold the giant, and the river was far too deep and far too wide for the giant to cross. So Molly ran across the Bridge of One Hair, And the giant stood on the other side and he said, "Woe betide you, Molly Whuppie, if you ever come back." "Well, maybe twice more I might come back, but never after that," said Molly. And she went back to the king's house, and she gave him the sword. And her oldest sister married the oldest prince, and there was a great big party. Well, when the party was over, the king said, "Now, Molly, you've done 2 great things, and you've done them well. But I could tell you another thing that would be even better." And Molly said, "Well, tell me then, king." And the king said, "Did you know that that giant has a purse of money under his pillow? And if you can sneak up to his house and get the purse of money out from under his pillow and bring it back to me, then I will let your second sister, marry my second son." And Molly looked at the second prince, and she looked at her second sister, and she said, "Well, very well, king, I will bring you that purse of money." And so she borrowed a different cloak, and she wrapped herself up in it, and she went back through the forest, and she crept up to the giant's house. And when the giant was noisily eating his supper, she crept into the house and she hid inside the linen closet where they kept all the towels and the bed sheets. It was a little bit stuffy in there. Can you imagine hiding between a lot of really, really big towels? It's a little warm. But the giant finished his supper and he went to bed. And when his snores were rattling the rafters, Molly crept out of the linen closet. And she crept up to the giant's bed. And she very carefully put her hand in between the pillow and the bed. And the giant moved. She stopped. And then the giant started snoring again. So she slipped her hand in a little bit further. And then the giant rolled over and he said something to his wife about robbers. And his wife said, "No, it's just your supper. Go back to sleep." All right. So he went back to sleep. And he started snoring again. And Molly reached in a little bit further and she touched the purse. And she took hold of the purse and she very carefully pulled the purse out from under the pillow. And just as she came out from under the pillow and she grasped it in her hands to run out the door, 1 gold coin fell out of the purse onto the floor. And it rattled and it clanged, and the giant jumped up with a roar, and Molly ran, and the giant ran, and they ran and they ran and they ran until they came to the bridge of 1 hair. And Molly scampered across the bridge and stood watching the giant on the other side, and the giant said, "Woe betide you, Molly Whuppie, if you ever come back again." And she said, "Well, maybe once more, but then never again." And Molly went back to the king's house, and she gave him the purse of gold. And the king's second son was married to Molly's second sister. And there was a grand party. Well, when the party was over, the king said, "Now, Molly, you've done 3 things and you've done them well. But I could tell you another thing that would be the best of all." "Well, then tell me then, king," said Molly. And the king said, "The giant has a ring. He wears it on his thumb. If you can bring me that ring, I will let you marry my youngest son." And Molly looked at the youngest prince, and she thought for a few minutes. "All right then, king, I will bring you the ring from the giant's thumb." So Molly borrowed another cloak, and she wrapped herself up in it. And she went back through the forest and she crept up to the giant's house. And when the giant was noisily eating his supper, she crept up and she hid next to the chimney in the little chimney corner. Well, when the giant went to sleep and his snores were rattling the rafters, Molly crept up to his bed. Now, luckily, this particular night, the giant was sleeping on his back with his arms flung out wide, and the arm that had the ring on the thumb was hanging out over the edge of the bed. And so Molly went up. She looked at the ring a little. Then she took out a little bottle of oil that she had brought with her. And she dripped a couple drips of oil onto the giant's thumb, and then she ducked under the bed. Nothing happened. So she slipped back out, and she reached up, and she took hold of that ring, and she very carefully began to work it off of the giant's finger. And it took a little bit of doing because it got stuck on his knuckle. But eventually Molly managed to get that ring loose and pull it off the giant's finger. And she had just tucked it in her pocket, and she was just getting ready to run out the door when the giant awoke with a roar, and he grabbed up Molly. And he said, "I've got you now, Molly Whuppie. Now I get to decide what to do with you." And Molly said, "Well, if I were you, I would put me in a sack with the dog and the cat and a needle and thread and a great big pair of shears, a big pair of scissors. And then I would hang me up on a nail, and I would go out into the forest, and I would cut the biggest stick I could find, and I would come back and I would beat me into jelly. That's what I would do if I were you." And the giant said, "Well, that's what I'm going to do." He thought he was rather clever because he hadn't really known what to do with Molly, and he had gotten Molly to tell him how to get rid of her. So the giant took Molly, and he popped her into a sack, and he put in the dog, and he put in the cat, and he put in a needle and a thread and a giant pair of scissors, and then he hung the sack up on a nail, and he went off into the forest to cut a big stick, a big cudgel, a big club. Well, no sooner had the giant's footsteps disappeared into the distance than Molly, who was petting the dog and the cat very gently, started singing out, "Oh, if only everyone could see what I can see. Oh, if only everyone could see what I can see." Well, the giant's wife wanted to know what Molly could see. And so she asked Molly, Molly, what can you see?" But Molly wouldn't answer. All she would say was, "Oh, if only everyone could see what I can see." Well, finally, the giant's wife got tired of asking and never knowing, and so she begged Molly to let her climb into the sack and see what Molly could see. And so Molly said, "Well, all right." And she took the giant pair of scissors and she cut a hole in the sack. And she climbed out through the hole in the sack. And the giant's wife climbed in through the hole in the sack. And quick as a wink, Molly pulled out the needle and the thread and she sewed the sack back shut. So the giant's wife was stuck in the dark with the dog and the cat. And all she could see was nothing. If she closed her eyes and then opened them again really fast, she saw a few stars. But those were inside of her. Those weren't outside of her. And so pretty soon she began to ask for Molly to take her out. But you see, Molly was getting ready to run away. And so she wasn't listening to the giant's wife. But unfortunately, right as Molly was getting ready to run out the door, she heard the giant coming back through the forest. And so she slipped in and she tucked herself behind the door and she figured she could sneak out as soon as she possibly could. Well, the giant came in the door and he took the sack down from the door and he threw it on the floor and he began to beat the sack, trying to beat Molly into jelly. But Molly wasn't in the sack. Well, as soon as he started to hit the sack, his wife started to cry out, "Stop, stop, stop, man, it's me in here, not Molly." But as soon as he started beating the sack, the dog and the cat started barking and howling and meowing and hissing and yowling, and he couldn't hear his wife crying for all of the noise that the animals were making. Well, eventually he realized that the voice he was hearing coming out of the sack didn't sound like Molly. And just about that time, Molly thought it might be safe for her to sneak out and go running for home. But unfortunately, as soon as she snuck out around the door, the giant saw her. And so Molly began to run, and the giant ran, and they ran, and they ran, and they ran, and they ran, until they came to the bridge of one hair. And Molly scampered across, and the giant stood on the other side, and he said, "Woe betide you, Molly Whuppie, if you ever come back again." And she just said, "Never again, goodbye." And she turned around and she scampered back to the king's house. And when she arrived, she gave him the ring from the giant's thumb. And she and the prince's youngest son were married. And the king admitted that Molly had always been his favorite. And so they had a grand party, even bigger than the other ones. And the swans had plenty to eat, and the people had plenty to eat. But you know what the giant had to eat? Nary a crumb, not even a bone. And that is the tale of Molly Whuppie from England. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope we'll see you again next week. Now, starting next week, our stories will be on Wednesdays and Fridays at 3 p.m. here on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page, and we will see you next week on Wednesday. See you later. Bye.